very much for coming today. This is our finale of the Anger in History series that we've had going for the last 2 years. I know from some of the faces that I see here, I've seen you at many of these, and I really, really appreciate that. Okay, so today we have a talk from an ancient historian, classics. This is supported by both the Department of History and the Department of Classics, and I believe we have a good mix in the audience from them as well. Let me introduce you to Professor Donna Montano, who is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Hello, everyone. It is my immense pleasure to introduce our guest, and I would say honor, but I will wait and see what the distinguished lecturer has to say about it. Professor Douglas Cairns is a professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Edinburgh, and he's made significant contributions to several fields. And I would say Greek tragedy, I'll name it first, epic poetry, lyric poetry, particularly ethics, Greek ethics, and the ancient emotions. His first monograph was a personal source of inspiration for my own book, so I have to name it here. It's called Eidos, The Psychology and Ethics of Honor and Shame in Ancient Greek Culture, and it came with Oxford in '93. And I very much enjoyed his book on Sophocles' Antigone, and I'll be very selective here because everybody said keep it short. So he's published hundreds of essays and articles in emotions in antiquity, emotions in the classical world. I'll just add a couple of things that seem extraordinary to me, and I admire many scholars, but Professor Cairns does something that I think very few people do, combine several fields like cognitive psychology, material culture, and literary sources to explain truly complicated and fascinating concepts. And in his work on grief or anger, for instance, he's used Greek vases, other material culture, gesture, body language, which is quite extraordinary, I would say. And he's looking both at what is culturally universal and also very particular for ancient Greece. So that is truly, truly admirable, and I still draw inspiration from his work. So please give a big round of applause to our guest today.
Thank you very much indeed, Dana. So I wore my jacket to come up here to show you that I know how to behave, but it's so warm I'm going to take it off. This is Harris tweed all the way from Scotland, and it's not suited to this weather.
Just the microphone is in there.
Oh, the microphone, right.
And this one is...
I'll swap it for there. So I'm very grateful indeed for the invitation. So it's really genuinely nice to be here. It's nice to see that life doesn't go on in spite of all the things we're hearing about America, in the UK and Europe at the moment. And it's also very nice to meet colleagues and grad students and to be treated so well as I have been since arriving. So very grateful indeed to Sarah, to Bruno and to Ben for the invitation, and to Dana for the very nice introduction. So this paper is more or less the first couple of chapters, maybe the first 3 chapters of a book that I'm writing with my colleague Mirko Cannavaro in Edinburgh, and it comes out of a project that I'll say a bit more about in a minute. We decided to work on honour because it's a subject that a lot has been written about. in my own subject in classics and ancient history, but also in other disciplines. But we believe that it's still very poorly understood, especially in our own disciplines of classics and ancient history. So since 2018, I've been working on this project that you see here, a European Research Council advanced grant, with my colleague Mirko in Edinburgh and some postdocs and PhD students, and we are trying to remedy the deficiency as we see it in the understanding of honour in classical studies. So we're working towards a total reassessment of what it is we talk about when we talk about honour in classical Greek societies. So all I can do today is give you an overview of that, but I think it should be enough to give you an idea of the project. It will fit, I think, pretty well in the theme of your series, because there will be a certain amount about anger, inevitably. But there'll also be a fair deal about the fact that honour is about much more than just anger and self-assertion. A typical and very serious failing of the scholarship on the notion of honour is to ghettoize the phenomenon. So people see it as limited only to some forms of interaction, so you find it in some contexts, but not in others. They see it as a concern of some social groups, and not of others. They see it as one particular value among many. They see it as a concern largely for men as opposed to women, and they see it as characteristic of only some forms of social organisation. So assumptions of this sort underpin this kind of formulation by Shada Novin and Daphne Oyserman. So they say, in honour societies, what others think matters, and vigilant attention to the possibility of losing face or losing respect is necessary. In dignity societies, others are de-emphasised, and what matters is one's own norms, values, and beliefs. So similar characterizations to this persist. Many of them deal with the United States, especially the southern states of the US. So Wyatt Brown, Nisbet and Cohen, and Robert Sapolsky in his book draws on the work of the first two here. You'll see that he kind of believes all this kind of stuff. So this is the idea that in the South, everybody's very nice to you because otherwise you might kill them. And the idea is that the culture of honour in the American South, which they've inherited from us, their Scots-Irish forebears, makes them acutely sensitive to things like disrespect and disesteem. And then you've got this book by James Bowman. Anyone read that? This is a very early precursor of the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing all too often these days, that we need to reassert traditional forms of masculinity, we need to roll back on women's rights, we need to reassert a culture of honour in Western societies like the United States, because we are being overwhelmed by two alien cultures of honour, which are immigrants and Muslims. So you can see where you can get with some of these formulations. So these characterizations bear clear comparison with an antithesis that I think many of you will also be familiar with, which was once fashionable, between shame cultures and guilt cultures. This is something that some of us, at least, including myself and Bernard Williams, believed had been decisively consigned to history. Sadly, not. With both of these antitheses, the honour versus dignity society one and the shame culture versus guilt culture one, the fundamental problem isn't so much identifying honour societies or shame cultures. It's relatively easy to find examples of that. The real problem is in finding examples of their the supposed counterparts, societies in which others are de-emphasised and what matters is one's own norms, values and belief. Because there's no society in which norms, values and beliefs arise in a social vacuum. Clearly, you can develop a reflective and personal system of values and beliefs that can be fundamental to your sense of yourself and character, but development of any belief system of that sort is inevitably intersubjective and social. Dignity is impossible without self-esteem and self-respect. And you don't get self-esteem and self-respect except through the interaction between your esteem for others and your respect for others and their esteem and respect for you. Dignity is acquired and performed in a social context. All human beings, this is the one I wanted to show us in the wrong order. All human beings from the earliest stages of life inhabit a world in which their identity, their sense of self, and their claims to recognition are intersubjectively constituted and interactively developed in an expanding circle of social contexts and relationships. So I've given you Andy Meltzoff's facial mimicry experiments, which take place with infants of 2 or 3 weeks old, and the big one, which is infinitely replicable, is the tongue protrusion experiment. So you do that to a baby of 2 weeks old and it will do it back. The baby has some kind of inner mental map of how it can, as an agent, respond to the actions of another agent. The primary concept here is developed by one of my Edinburgh colleagues, Colwyn Trevarthen, and it's this notion of primary intersubjectivity. This is the interactive intersubjectivity that the infant and other human beings, primarily the caregiver, have in the first few months of life, develops then into secondary intersubjectivity, where you and I, the infant and a caregiver or another, can share attention in focusing on the actions of yet others. And these are 2 books, one by Michael Tomasello and one by Sean Gallagher, that take these ideas and really run with them in recent literature. I would really recommend both of those. So the distinction that underlies antitheses such as honour versus dignity societies and shame versus guilt cultures is essentially about the difference between values that are intrinsic and values which are extrinsic in their orientation. And in principle, these are valid categories for the analysis of the behaviour and beliefs of individuals and groups. They also have a degree of utility in measuring differences between groups, societies, and cultures, synchronously, but also diachronically, differences that arise through historical changes in social, political, and economic circumstances. So the poles of the antithesis here are represented on the one hand by values to which people are deeply committed, even when material success and social approval might tend to pull them in the opposite direction. These are the intrinsic values. And on the other hand, you have values that are fundamentally oriented towards external things, material rewards and social approval, the extrinsic values. So there is an argument that contemporary First World societies, since the days of Thatcher and Reagan, have seen a gradual erosion of a more communitarian consensus, and so they've been increasingly dominated by individuals whose values are unduly extrinsic in their orientation. The current President of the United States is widely regarded as a narcissist. He's clearly very interested in material success and social approval, social reinforcement. Here's a book written by a former British Foreign Secretary, Lord David Owen, about Trump. A close analogue in the United Kingdom had to resign from the office of Prime Minister when it became apparent that he and his administration were infinitely more concerned about creating an illusion of ethical behaviour as opposed to cultivating the substance of ethical behaviour. This is when the lies that they told to maintain a facade of public respectability only served to illustrate their contempt, as the Guardian journalist John Harris points out there, for shared social norms and for citizens who expected their leaders to uphold these social norms. And here you have the report of the House of Commons Select Committee on the untruths told by the Right Honourable Boris Johnson MP, our former Prime Minister. But we can't assume that even individuals like them, even individuals whose values are excessively extrinsic in orientation, have no intrinsic norms whatsoever. And even in contemporary First World societies, obsessed with consumerism, materialism, image and celebrity, it isn't the case that those values escape all censure altogether, or that they are endorsed by all people at all times. The distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic values is useful for analysing the ways in which individuals and groups may tend more in one direction than in another, but the extent to which changes and differences in socioeconomic structure foster different mixtures at different periods is also a legitimate object of sociological and historical inquiry. But there's no group and no historical society, and perhaps except in extreme pathological circumstances, no individual either, to which some combination of these values is not found. So despite strong reasons for believing that contemporary Western societies, and especially their elites, are subject to a never stronger pull in the direction of extrinsic values, the paradox is that educated elites within those societies have used and continue to use labels such as shame culture and honour society to denigrate and patronize internal and external others. So inner city teenagers and their gangs, immigrants of various origins, citizens of the southern states of the US and their Scots ancestors, Native Americans, the Japanese, Northern Europeans, Southern Europeans, North Africans, and the ancient Greeks. Now, it is of course possible to pursue praise and esteem as if they were ends in themselves, without any commitment to developing or manifesting the qualities for which you are praised or esteemed. But that would be pathological. It would be a perversion of the normal pattern in which people prize and try to manifest the excellencies for which they want to be praised and respected. As Aristotle reminds us, it's pleasant to be admired and to be honoured. But for him, this pleasure is not an end in itself. So for some people, it's purely instrumental. It can be a means towards advancement of some further sort. But for good people, for other people, it's about seeking well-informed confirmation of their own view of themselves. So for these people, the pleasure of being praised or esteemed or respected lies in trusting the judgment of those who say that we are good. And this, Aristotle repeatedly notes, is precisely why people seek the esteem of others. It's in order to confirm their own sense of themselves as, in some sense, good people. So the esteem of others, the focus allegedly of extrinsic values, validates and enhances self-esteem. So consistently, Aristotle sees honour, this Greek word here, time, which he typically understands in a relatively restricted sense as the esteem that we receive from other people. Aristotle sees time as something that confirms our own positive view of ourselves. So the value of time for Aristotle isn't just about being popular and not just about being praised. It's about confirming our own image of ourselves as people who actually have the qualities that we want to be valued for by others. So as Adam Smith puts it, it's a matter of wanting to be praiseworthy, not just wanting to be praised. It's about wanting to be respectable as well as respected. And for Smith, of course, this is a fundamental aspect of human sociality. More recently, the literary scholar Alexander Sandy Welsh emphasized the need to demystify honour and treat it as one kind of motivation that all are subject to. So to the economist Geoffrey Brennan and philosopher Philip Pettit, dismiss as a grievous error the common assumptions that the concern for honour and esteem is found only in small-scale face-to-face societies, that it's something purely aristocratic, or that it's a feature only of certain marginalised counter-cultural groups. So different individuals, groups and societies care about others' esteem for different reasons, in different ways, and on the basis of different qualities, but none of these differences entails a distinction between societies in which individuals want to see their self-image validated by others and societies in which they don't. And Aristotle is not an outlier in this respect. In the fictional dialogue between the Sicilian tyrant Hieron and the lyric poet Simonides in Xenophon, Xenophon has Hieron draw a strong distinction between respect on the one hand and fear on the other hand, esteem on the one hand and flattery on the other hand, that emphasizes the relation between respect, esteem and self-esteem. So, according to Hieron, the tyrant can never be sure that the praise of his subjects is sincere or genuine. Where Simonides argues that tyrants enjoy obedience, deference, and respect and admiration to the highest degree, and so benefit from the greatest of human pleasures, the esteem of their fellow creatures, Hieron observes that deference that's coerced through fear is not deference at all. So this kind of deference enforced through fear reflects only the extreme imbalance in power between the tyrant and his subject. As you see in this passage here, genuine marks of esteem and respect, timai, honours, are different. These genuine marks of esteem and respect indicate sincere appreciation of the qualities and actions in their recipients that benefit others, and show these marks of esteem show genuine regard for the recipient's well-being. So it's about concern in the case of showing esteem in reward for genuinely beneficial qualities. So the tyrant here, like any other human being, doesn't just want to hear nice things about himself. He wants people sincerely to believe that those things are true. If only genuine esteem and genuine respect are enough, then what the tyrant wants, like everyone else, isn't just praise, but validation. These links between esteem and self-esteem, links that in fact highlight the complementarity and interdependence of honour and dignity, receive powerful ancient support in an anonymous late 5th or early 4th century treatise preserved at least in part in the Protrepticus of Iamblichus, the Pythagorean philosopher. As excerpted, the text begins with the topic of excellence or virtue. So it's hard to achieve excellence, he says, in fragment 1. But it quickly turns to the topic of reputation, doxa in Greek. Just as it takes time to achieve virtue, so you have to start young, and you have to behave consistently for the rest of your life if you're going to acquire reputation, doxa. And it's only then, after a great deal of time has passed, and you've repeatedly shown yourself to be a person of a certain sort, that people will believe that you actually are what you seem to be. But don't worry, we'll break this passage down. And this is partly because people are reluctant to praise. They don't find it pleasant to honour others. They think they're losing something by doing so. So here you have the germ of the idea that honour is a zero-sum game. If I honour you, I lose something and you gain. So some people do feel that. But there's also a matter of caution against being deceived. So trust is fraught with danger. You don't award it easily. You have to be cautious about the people you interact with. So doubts about the accuracy of your reputation, the malicious envy, what's called in Greek phonos, that makes people reluctant to praise, and the fear of being deceived, these things are dispelled only if you can demonstrate consistently that you actually possess the qualities on which your reputation rests. And so the process of building a reputation, this is the argument here in the anonymous Iamblichi, the process of building a reputation is simultaneously one of developing virtue. You can't have one without the other. Virtue creates, as we see in this PowerPoint here, in the red bit in the middle, both trust and reputation. In an environment in which neither of these things is readily granted, it's difficult to be trusted. It's difficult to amass a reputation, even if a reputation can be lost in an instant. So this means, this I think is the beauty of this argument, there's a strong selective pressure to be what you seem to be. The pressure comes from the social environment. So this notion, time, honour, isn't something that people will confer upon you indiscriminately. They need to be convinced that an individual really possesses the qualities that are worthy of it. Individuals, other individuals, have no interest in encouraging us to pretend to be virtuous, and they're constantly on guard against people who pretend to be virtuous, people who deceive them. An individual's fellow citizens are acutely sensitive to social comparison as well. So the recognition and esteem that you want from them are things that they also want fervently for themselves. So the author believes that people will recognize others' qualities where it becomes undeniable that they actually do possess them. But even if that's too optimistic, it's clear that actually possessing the qualities you claim to possess substantially improves your chances of recognition and esteem. And so the distinction between honour societies and dignity societies is based on a false antithesis. Intrinsic and extrinsic values, as interconnected and mutually reinforcing things, are central to all human societies, including those of the ancient Greeks, although the content of those values is of course subject to considerable cultural variation. The ancient Greek time is a reflex of a much more general human concern for esteem, validation, respect, and recognition. Though the range of the English language term honour has become reduced and etiolated, the concern for honour isn't typical only of a certain kind of primitive society, obsessed with extrinsic values to the exclusion of the intrinsic ones. Now, this distinction between honour societies and dignity societies, as we've seen already, doesn't arise from nowhere. The shame culture and guilt culture antithesis that preceded it, very much an American phenomenon, with the pupils of Franz Boas, Ruth Benedict, and Margaret Mead here. That antithesis worked, at least in some of its simpler forms, with a similar contrast between societies whose norms depend on external sanctions and those that depend on internal sanctions. The classical scholar Arthur Adkins preferred the label results culture to shame culture, but he still believed that in a results culture, like the one we're supposed to find in the Homeric poems, the individual cannot fall back upon his own opinion of himself, for his self only has the value which other people put on it. And even the great French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, once in a 1965 volume, which has been absolutely seminal for the notions and the idea of honour and shame in classical studies, he once espoused a similar view. He said, "The point of honour is the basis of a moral code of an individual who sees himself always through the eyes of others, who has no need of others for his existence, because the image he has of himself is indistinguishable from that presented to him by other people." But if that was the case, the only possible attitude to losing face or losing respect wouldn't be what Novin and Oyserman say it is. It wouldn't be vigilant attention. It wouldn't be anger. It would be acquiescence. If my self only has the value that you put on it, what can I do about it? I should just accept it, according to this line of argument. The fact that individuals in any society guard against loss of face and react defensively or angrily when seriously threatened with disrespect shows that scenarios of that kind depend fundamentally on a discrepancy between the person's image in their own eyes and the image presented to them by others. So maintaining face as Irving Goffman long ago demonstrated, and Gloria Origi has recently reaffirmed in this brilliant book, Reputation, from 2018. Maintaining face is in all societies a matter of interactive negotiations between our own self-presentation, the reception of our self-presentation by others, and our own reception of others' self-presentation. So as Goffman puts it, your demeanour projects and protects your face and takes a certain line, but always in a context in which attention to the face of other people and the line of other people is equally essential. You can't do it in a vacuum. You can't do it by yourself. Social interaction involves continuous bi-directional monitoring of your own demeanour, other people's deference, and your own deference towards other people's demeanour. The social world that this presupposes isn't one in which the self only has the value which other people put on it, as Atkins would have it. It is rather one in which, as Goffman puts it, the individual must rely on others to complete the picture of him of which he himself is allowed to paint only certain parts. So this is an interactive process, and the interactive nature of that process is also highlighted by the anonymous Iamblichi. The community or group on whose evaluation honour depends has an interest in determining what counts as excellence for it. But the selective pressure exerted by the social environment is also complemented by the aims and needs of the individual. So it's assumed that reputation is something that any rational person would want, just as malice, envy, thonos, which destroys reputation, is something that everyone would want to avoid. But as in Aristotle, as in Xenophon's Hiero, and in Adam Smith, people value reputation not for its own sake, but in order that the qualities that they possess and value should be recognized and valued by others. So as we see here in fragment 2, section 4, the second passage here, just as trust is the absence of doubt that other people are what they seem to be, so the pursuit of reputation is at the same time the desire to be recognized as the person you want to be. In 2:1, the first passage there. So this isn't a matter of simple conformity to other people's expectations. It's not about heteronomy as opposed to autonomy. As the author observes in fragment 4, a truly good person pursues reputation not by assuming an adornment that belongs to someone else, there's a garment metaphor here of putting on a cloak or something like that, but by means of their own excellence. You don't borrow your reputation from others, it depends on what you really are. So such a person wants to be praiseworthy rather than merely praised, respectable as well as respected. I can't emphasize enough the contribution here by my fellow Glasgow graduate, Adam Smith. Reputation, trust and virtue are co-created in ways that allow us to manifest the qualities that are valued both by ourselves and by our communities. So already we're seeing something very, very fundamental to the notion of honour, and it's trust. How many handbooks do you know which have entries under the word honour that emphasise that trust is a fundamental thing that honour helps create? So this means that, contrary to what's sometimes asserted, the role of the community or of the group on whose evaluation honour depends and in whose gift honour resides isn't simply that of an audience. So the community isn't just an audience adjudicating between rival claims to excellence. This is what the Hulkeskamps say following Georg Simmel, but it might work for competition, but it doesn't work for the notion of honour. The community is always an active participant in its own right. The community has a strong interest in determining what excellence is, and the community will reward with its esteem only those forms of behaviour that align with at least some of its own values. So excellencies that are rewarded with social esteem cannot be excellencies that serve the selfish interests of the individual alone. And this is another recurrent theme in ancient theorizations of honour. So for Aristotle in the Rhetoric, honour, time again, is defined as a sign of a positive reputation for beneficence. Semeion euergetikes eudoxias in Rhetoric 1.5. So people are honoured, he says, for what they do or for what they can do for other people. It's clearer in the Greek than it is in the English that this euergesia is about benefiting others. And some of Aristotle's examples of honours conferred, so for example, grants of land, the right to have the front seat in the theatre, statues, maintenance at the expense of the state, and so on. These things indicate that he's thinking largely of major acts of public beneficence and the public honours that are given in exchange. But he also has interpersonal benefactions in mind when he talks in the middle of the passage there about gifts, a gift. And it's this kind of benefaction that is to the fore in a passage we've looked at before in Xenophon, in the Hiero, 7:8-10. So here again, the tyrant contrasts the servile performances of those whose deference has to be coerced with the freely given honours, including purely personal expressions, such as standing up to give someone else your seat as a mark of respect on the part of those who respond to their benefactors in friendship and not in fear. So this is freely given as opposed to coerced. But again, the most nuanced and fullest exposition is in the anonymous Iamblichi. So for that author as well, virtue is about benefiting other people. Though excellencies are qualities of individuals, to bring your excellencies to perfection requires using them for good ends. You have to use them to benefit other people. So this is about doing good in the community. That's the fullest realization of excellence. And we achieve this to the fullest extent when we benefit the greatest number. And there's an idea with a great future ahead of it. Not by material redistribution of wealth, he says. You don't just give them your money. You support the cohesion of the community through law and justice. This is what forms and sustains political communities, he says. The development of individual virtue in tandem with the acquisition of social esteem doesn't just serve the interests of the individual, it creates what the anonymous calls eunomia, law-abidingness. He devotes an entire fragment 7, to this topic. And this is something that benefits the community and all its members. And this is the complement of the argument that we had earlier in fragment 2. In fragment 2, we saw that the community, in its own interests, exerts significant pressure on the development of the qualities that it values, and it rewards these qualities with honour and reputation. Here, the virtue that reputation rewards lies in acting in the interests of the greatest number of your fellow citizens. And so this means that though it's possible to regard the community as an audience of interactions between typically elite individuals, even in that scenario, the role of the community is not limited simply to adjudicating between these individuals' claims. Even when it's a matter of deciding who is the better of these two, the community is still a player, not just an audience. But it's also characteristic of classical Athenian thought in this area to make the community not so much one participant in a three-way relation as an audience or umpire of interactions between competing elite males, but rather an interactant in dyadic one-to-one relations in its own right. And if you think about it, this is the logic of the Athenian system of public honours and of ancient euergetism more widely. It's about the community and the individual in partnership, in a reciprocal relationship of what the Greeks called charis. But that logic also holds good in purely interpersonal dyadic relationships between two people face to face. The quotation from Neumann and Overman, which we'll come back to again, from which we started, foregrounds individuals in honour societies paying vigilant attention to what others think. This presupposes, as we've seen, not absolute heteronomy, but an aspiration that our own image of ourselves should be validated by others. But you notice that this vigilant attention is said to focus not only on the possibility of losing face, but also on the danger of losing respect. So Novin and Oyserman frame the contrast solely in terms of an individual's orientation towards extrinsic or intrinsic values. But if we just concentrate even on the dynamics of honour that their own very, very reduced account presupposes, then we can see that there's a lot more involved than just the aims of an individual preoccupied with the opinions of others. This individual not only seeks esteem and wants to avoid disesteem in the eyes of an audience, that individual also projects a self-image that they long to see validated. So this individual seeks as a reward for her excellencies what Steve Darwell calls appraisal respect. And this matters to her as an individual and depends on her own idea of what counts as excellence, but validation depends on the extent to which that idea of excellence is endorsed and promoted by the audience. So this is again about the interaction between individual and group values, an interaction in which both parties have an important part to play. This is the point though. In paying attention to the danger of losing respect, on the other hand, the individual isn't performing excellence before an audience. The individual is instead enacting a claim to what Darwell calls recognition respect. This is a claim that some aspect of the individual's worth, or let's say dignity, because it's the same word, should be recognized by the other person. This is fundamentally a feature of dyadic, one-to-one interpersonal relationships. Novin and Oyserman's formulation is intended to center more or less entirely on an individual's dependence on others' approval, and yet limited though it is, it presupposes multiple roles and multiple ways of dealing with honour. Not only seeking praise and esteem, but also giving praise and esteem. And not only seeking and giving esteem, appraisal respect, but also claiming and showing recognition respect. Quite a lot going on, even in this very etiolated notion of what honour is. The focus in that context, the context of recognition respect, is on connections of reciprocity in which each party benefits from their mutual recognition. And this is the sense in which time, or honour, is fundamental to mutual, non-zero-sum, cooperative relationships that the Greeks would have characterized in terms of charis, exchange reciprocity, and philia, friendship. This is why, in Xenophon's Hiero again, Simonides counters the tyrant's anxieties about the sincerity of others' respect by observing that genuine respect from others is fostered by your own respect for them. We honour others for the benefits that they confer on us, but one of those benefits is itself honour, and mutual honouring benefits each party mutually. Honour is often described in terms of zero-sum forms of competition. It's meant to be a limited good. So if I have it, you can't have it. Even where it's just about achieving appraisal respect, that isn't necessarily accurate. But where honour is about my recognizing you and you're recognizing me, it cannot possibly be zero-sum. Because mutual cooperation, as Robert Wright has shown, just doesn't get off the ground unless it gives both parties something more, something greater than the sum of the two parts that they bring to the interaction. Cooperation is fundamentally non-zero sum in nature. If I lend you $5, I do it when it's easy for me to give $5 away. You need it more than I do. When I get the $5 back, I may need it more than you do. The value depends on the situation. It's not fixed. Darwall's later writings, Steve Darwall's later writings, distinguish not only between appraisal respect and recognition respect, but also between two varieties of recognition respect. He talks about the genuinely second personal form of recognition respect between two people, as persons, and what he calls honor respect. So honor respect meets his original condition for recognition respect. It does consist in giving appropriate consideration or recognition to some feature of the object in deliberating about what to do. But according to Darwall, it's not properly second personal because it focuses on rank, status, and roles, and not on mutual accountability and equal authority or dignity. And these are very useful heuristic distinctions, valid in a number of contexts, but the point is there's nothing like these distinctions in Greek. In Greek, we just have time, which is appraisal respect, recognition respect, and what Darwall calls honor respect. The same word covers all these forms of attitude and behavior. And Greek terminology, in fact, highlights aspects of honor that the labels of other languages, such as English, often obscure. Because time isn't just a matter of the respect that a person receives from others, or the esteem in which a person is held by others. The very same term also denotes the individual's own claims to recognition or esteem. So to put it simply, time can be something I get from you as esteem for my excellence. It can be something I get from you as recognition of my status as a human being or as a professor or whatever it might be. But it can also be the quality I possess that demands those forms of esteem and recognition. So we see this most clearly in cases in which time is a matter of the performance of a particular role. A role may command other people's respect, and you may be allocated a role as a mark of esteem, but this doesn't negate the fact that the term time can denote the role itself, and therefore denote the prerogatives, what you're able to do because you possess that role. So this passage here is about divine prerogatives, and it's also very early, and it's also poetic, but it illustrates the point perfectly. Poseidon here is saying, I have this time. This time requires recognition from all of you. And his time that he demands to see recognized is about his positive freedom to exercise his prerogatives without let or hindrance from others. It's about roles and prerogatives that entail claims to respect. This is the sense in which the Greek time can articulate something like a concept of rights. So time can also be a matter of who an agent is and what an agent does, as well as of the ways in which the agent is regarded by others. And this is the sense in which all Athenian citizens in the Athenian democracy of the 5th and 4th centuries BC and beyond are said to enjoy equal time as citizens. There is a time involved in being a citizen, and all citizens have that time to the same extent. They have other forms of time to different extents, but there's a common horizontal form of honor that they all share. So this is about the respect that they deserve from others, both citizens and non-citizens alike. But it's also about what they can do, given that they have these rights. It's about the privileges and prerogatives that they are entitled to exercise as long as they remain citizens in good standing. And these are privileges or prerogatives that a citizen can forfeit if they fall short of the required standards of performance. This is what the ancient Greeks called atimia, which is partial or total loss of rights, of the rights to do things that citizens are normally entitled to do. It's on this basis that honor can be regarded as what the anthropologist Frank Henderson Stewart calls a claim right. It's the source of an entitlement claim or a claim to recognition respect. So time goes both ways. It can be something I have, and it can be something I get from you. The same is true of eidos. So eidos can refer to the sense of shame that comes into play when your own honour is at stake, whether it's from a loss of face, doing something inefficient, stupid, whatever, or from a failure to meet your obligations for others. Here's an example from Iliad 22, where Hector has, by his own decision, caused the deaths of many of his fellow Trojans. He now is faced with the prospect of being killed by Achilles on the plains of Troy, or retreating within the walls. But he says, if he goes back within the walls, some baser person will criticize him, and he feels shame on that account. So that's definitely eidos as shame. But in this passage, Agamemnon tells Diomedes not to choose someone for a mission solely on the basis of his rank. And he says, don't choose this person on the basis of rank out of eidos. So there, eidos is what Darwall calls honour respect. Respect for the other person's status. Direct respect for the direct recipient of your actions. One-to-one dyadic respect, recognition, respect. So that's true of eidos. The same is true, of hubris. Hubris is a way of going wrong, as we see here from Aristotle's definition of it, not just about other people's claims to honour. Hubris involves denying other people the respect that they are due. It's also about your own honour. It's about overstating your own claims to the respect that you seek from them. So the honour of both parties is at play in this one-to-one interaction. And of course, where do we get this little thumbnail narrative account of what hubris is? We get it in Aristotle's account of anger in Rhetoric Book 2. So anger is about, just as much about the other person's overestimation of what they are entitled to, as it is about the diminution of your own claims to respect that you experience at their hands. So Greek terminology explicitly acknowledges that these things go both ways. They're bidirectional, they're interactive. That's how the interplay of esteem, respect, self-esteem and dignity are enacted. This is something that characterizes, again, Goffman and his notion of interaction ritual, or Brown and Levenson's account of politeness theory. It's also fundamental to the Hegelian insight developed by Axel Honneth in particular, that interpersonal recognition is fundamentally mutual in character. So the point here is not just that demanding recognition without ever giving it is impractical, although that's certainly true. Someone who goes about demanding recognition but never giving it to anyone will not get it for very long. That's also atypical behavior, and it's also transgressive behavior. But it's not just that. It's much more fundamentally that demanding recognition from someone else is in its own way a way of recognizing that person, whether we like it or not. Just as trying to deny someone else recognition means that that other person is no longer a source of recognition for us. Connoisseurs, cognoscenti of Hegel will recognize the master-slave dialectic behind this. As I mentioned already, developmental psychology also suggests that the roots of this mutual implication of the self and the other go back to the very earliest interactions between the infant and the primary caregiver in the first few weeks of life. As Charles Taylor has put it succinctly, a self requires other selves. Self-presentation can take place only where other selves are presented. And this bidirectional focus of the presentation of the self and the other is absolutely fundamental to all human interaction. All cultures have to calibrate that notion of self-worth that is sometimes called dignity, not just against other people's willingness to validate your claims, your dignity, but also against the need to show esteem for others and the need to recognize others. And that is what honor is all about. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, I will resist the urge to use Professor Montianu's pun and say that, of course, we thank you for this fantastic paper. That's right. It's fair to say, given our huge esteem and respect for you, that it's a great honor for us that you're here. But with this sort of silly puns out of the way, let's open the floor for questions, please. Please, Sarah.
I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, the microphone doesn't amplify voices, but it captures it for the computer.
Okay, should I hold it here?
Yes, if you could hold it
Okay.
somewhere. That's great.
Right.
I'll say it again then. Thank you. I really enjoyed that.
Thank
I
you.
want to try a kind of weird instance of this out. I was thinking a lot about the gods. And I came to think particularly of the passage from Iliad 2, towards the beginning of Iliad 2, where Zeus ponders how best to honor Achilles. And then he eventually comes up with the idea of the false dream and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So what I'm turning around in my mind is there's no real community between Achilles and Zeus. If anything, it's the community between Zeus and Thetis that brought us to this point. There's no reciprocal relationship. How exactly is that working? In other words, in a situation where you've got a huge superior, namely Zeus, and someone who's not even really aware that the superior is pondering this and will eventually just bestow it.
That's true. I mean, I think you put your finger on the answer in the question. So Zeus is doing a favor to Thetis. So because Thetis is Achilles' mother, he's able to call in that favor, and he does. You know, he mentions the fact that she has benefited Zeus in the past, and therefore she has a degree of purchase on him in asking for this favor. So he knows that much. He knows about their relationship, and as her son, he's able to draw on that relationship. It's true he doesn't have the same call on reciprocity from Zeus as an individual as Thetis does, and no human being does. So one of the things, I mean, I'm sure, you know, this is just explaining what you know very well already about the way these things work in the Iliad, but it seems to be the case that gods do reciprocate favors. They do regard themselves as being party to an exchange of benefits that's called philotes in the Iliad between them and human beings. And very much the narrative towards the end is a kind of justification of the utility of that relationship in the case that Hector, his claims are not completely denied, even though Achilles, through his relationship with Thetis, is kind of closer to the gods than Hector is. But Zeus says, well, it's not about, in fact, he says, what does he say? Uk esitai mia time. They will not be one time. So he's saying, Hector has a claim because he's burnt all these thigh bones for us. Achilles also has a claim, and we don't have to say it's got to be one or the other. It's not zero sum. You can honour them both, and Hector is honoured by, you know, having his body given back for burial in exchange for his benefactions to the gods, and Achilles gets the great kudos, I think the ultimate kudos that he achieves in the Iliad, of doing this wonderfully humane, supererogatory thing of giving the enemy's body back. So actually, maybe where there is no community at all is between Achilles and Priam. That's where Achilles has to go completely beyond the bonds of ordinary reciprocity into a form of generalized reciprocity, as Salins would call it, where you give without any real expectation of return. So, but it's still couched in reciprocal terms because of this wonderful passage of the jars of Zeus. That it's not that there's a relationship between Achilles and Priam, and there's certainly no relationship between Achilles and Hector. Achilles wanted to eat him raw at one stage, and Hector's mother wanted to eat him raw. A lot of eating raw going on there. But he still says, you know, this is what it's like for all of us. It's like this for all human beings. And so there's some sense of community that I think exists only for that moment of time in the final book of the Iliad. But then, of course, it exists for the whole of the rest of ancient Greek literature. It's a hugely exemplary passage, but they start fighting again. You know, it's a very, very temporary recognition of that common humanity. On the one hand, central to Greek notions of pity, and again, pity is supererogatory. It's not something that you can demand as an obligation, but you know, such things do take place. So yeah, in terms of the gods, I think there are ways in which human beings can make claims on the gods, but the gods, of course, power comes into it. They have infinitely more power to demand the benefactions that they seek. And they also have the power that allows them to evade any expectation that there will necessarily be a return.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you for the presentation of the honor. We use this term many times.
Yep.
This is very, very nice to hear a formal presentation on honor. My question is related to a term of dignity society or dignity culture. And it is defined, according to your presentation, in a dignity society. One's own norm is matters.
Yeah.
But I think in practice, all of us would say we follow the social norm.
Yeah, of course.
Instead of our own norm.
Yeah.
Then my question is, two questions. In a dignity society, is there a universal value? If it's a universal value, we just follow that value.
Right.
Number one question. Number two, can you give an example of a dignity society in the real world?
No, there are no dignity societies. That's what I was saying. So we will never find such a thing. So anyone who has any sense of dignity has acquired that in mutual social interaction. First of all with the primary caregiver, then with others in the immediate circle, and then with wider members of society. To have a sense of worth, you know, obviously we could go into very kind of basic philosophical points here, but all of these are shared cultural concepts. They're not things that people develop individually all by themselves. So even if you have a notion of yourself as a possessor of dignity, someone who wants to perform dignity, you haven't developed that as a kind of private language all for yourself. You've acquired it in socialization in your own society. And that kind of undercuts the idea that it might be something that's only a matter of your own idea of yourself. I think it can never be a matter of your own idea of yourself. If it were, it would be extremely unusual and probably pathological. And you know, this is the thing. So if you think of Trump, to maybe go back to the slide in which I showed you Boris Johnson, he is utterly shameless in some respects. So he does things that most people regard as completely revolting and beyond the pale, and he doesn't care about that. He knows the criticism of it exists, but he doesn't care. So is he a hero of dignity because of that? And equally at the same time, in other respects, he's totally thin-skinned. The slightest criticism can set him off. So this is someone who both cares a lot and doesn't care very much about other people's opinions in different contexts and scenarios. So even with someone like him, it's going to be far too simple to say, own idea of self, others' idea of you. It's never going to be as simple as that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really interesting talk. I actually wanted to ask about one of your comments about power and in connection with the hiero, which I love, and about the honor of the tyrant.
Yeah.
Because I gather the issue for hiero, as I recall, is he's living in fear all the time.
That's right. Yeah.
And Simonides, of course, wants to convince him. Well, the way to get out of this is to get honor. You don't have sort of the power to resist social pressure.
Yeah.
But what if, Hiero goes home and says, oh, I just need more power. I don't need to worry about honor. I just need to get more power so that I can protect myself better, resist things better than I currently can.
Yeah, although it's Hieron himself who's worried about all that kind of stuff. So he's the insecure one. So he thinks he will never have enough bodyguards to be able to rest easily at night. He knows that people are telling him what he wants to hear already. So I think he knows that there's a vast asymmetry in power between himself and his subjects, and it's still not enough. And in fact, what Simonides is advising him to do is to stop being a tyrant. If you look at Aristotle, the end of Book 5 of the Politics, that's the advice there as well. Successful tyrannies are the ones which are least like tyrannies. They're the ones which share more power with others. They're the ones which don't indulge in gratuitous acts of offence towards private citizens. They don't try and just take whatever they can get from the community. They don't violate other people sexually and all this kind of stuff. So I think that's the point of the hierarchy, really, is to say that tyranny as a regime is just not sustainable. Interestingly enough, in a bit I didn't show you from the anonymous Jamblichie, that's exactly what he says as well. So there's a passage which is very, very similar to the passage in Plato's Gorgias, where Callicles says, yeah, okay, all you bums can band together and they can restrain the strong people, but that's not power. And for the anonymous Jamblichie, that is precisely power. He says, as long as we stick together, these guys who think they're supermen can never conquer us. The only way in which they get the upper hand is if we let eunomia slip into anomia. And, well, draw your own contemporary conclusions.
I mean, I think I've always understood why Simonides, those of us who are being tyrannized, want to convince Hiero not to just run out the clock on amassing power. But yeah, hopefully you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not written from the perspective of becoming a better, more autocratic tyrant. It's clear that the dice are loaded against anyone who wants to make that kind of argument.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that so much. In talking about honor as sort of a zero-sum game, you made this very mathematical in some ways. And to me, I'm somebody who studies the medieval period, particularly feud in that time, and the mathematics makes sense because when you look at the legal system, every human being actually has value. And so you can make this something that is very mathematical. So I guess I'm wondering how much, I know nothing about Greek law. How is this tied in there? Do they use mathematics? Is it an eye for an eye, or the eye of a rich man against the eye of a poor man? It's a different value? Or
no, I don't think it's as rigid as that. It's more contextually variable. So there is a notion that well, I mean, if you think of the histories of Herodotus, for example, what he starts trying to establish at the beginning is who started it. And then belligerents all the way through are arguing about who started it. What was the first act of aggression? And when you think of it, that isn't necessarily primitive. We're still talking about that in certain conflicts throughout the world at the moment. And of course, we're talking about what Marshall Sahlins called negative reciprocity there. So we're talking about people who took with no intention to return or initiated gratuitous aggression against people who didn't harm them in any way. So these things really do still matter. But there's a sort of contextualized nuance to it in terms of the legitimacy of some forms of retaliation on the basis that if you have been offended and your time has been questioned, you are perfectly entitled to take retaliatory action within reason. But it's the within reason that creates the room for maneuver and doubt. So Herodotus is perfectly willing, for example, to talk about excessive forms of redress. People who were entitled to do something but did too much, which again raises certain contemporary parallels. Thinking about those things in somewhere where you can study in a nutshell, where you can study a great Greek thinker trying to work with these notions for a popular audience in Aristotle's Rhetoric. It's very clear. So he says that in the context of his definition of anger, one of the causes of anger, all of the causes of anger involve belittling someone. But one of them is this deliberate desire to build yourself up at the expense of the other person. And he says that's hubris, and hubris is doing things over which there is aiskune. So that's that word, it's the counterpart of the word eidos that I mentioned already, for the patient, for the sufferer. And we don't know whether aiskune means shame or disgrace, because it could mean both. And it might encompass, in fact, both. But clearly, if it's disgrace, this isn't an inevitable outcome. Because if the person gets angry and retaliates, and if it is, of course, accepted as hubris by any onlooker there may be, then it's the perpetrator who's disgraced, not the victim. Because hubris is wrong. Hubris is a vice, is bad. And if it means shame, then also it's not an inevitable consequence, because some people don't feel shame when you insult them. They feel anger, and they do something about it. So it's not a one-to-one, in-the-moment interaction of I dishonor you and I get your honor, like that. Context and who's watching and what the values are and how others might judge it and how you react yourself and how you're able to stand up for yourself, they all make a difference too. So, but your point is a very good one, because time is the ancient Greek word for value. It means material value as well. And so it can refer to the value of material objects. And there's an awful lot of material language about giving and taking time, adding to time, subtracting from time, all this kind of stuff. So it is possible to commodify it. And of course it is possible to see it as zero sum. So the anonymous Yambliki has an example. Lots of people do treat it as a zero sum game. They're wrong to treat it so, he says. Plutarch has a huge disquisition about this in his How to Manage the Republic, whatever it's called in Latin or Greek. And he says it doesn't have to be that way. You can treat it as, my enemy's book has been remaindered and I'm happy, and my enemy has been promoted and I'm unhappy. All that kind of stuff. But you don't have to. You can share honor. We can all have some. In the Athenian state, the state controls honor very much like the money supply. They can keep manufacturing it. Okay, so its value, you might think, and some people do say this, its value becomes diluted. So the Athenian state in the 4th century stops honouring just the people who've done something very, very spectacular and starts honouring absolutely everybody who served, So people who serve on the council, regardless of what they've done, get a crown at the end of their term of office. And if one council doesn't get it, they complain that you honoured all these other councils, you didn't honour us, what's going on? But yeah, there is a supply of honour that can be infinitely increased. It's not a limited good.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. My question has to do with honor and how it relates to gender. And I want to clarify before I start that I'm not asking whether women can be honored, because I think we would probably all agree that they can.
Yep.
But I am specifically wondering whether you think the conception of honor itself, especially as it relates to respect, dignity, and especially when you were talking about rights, those that Athenian citizens, who are, of course, are men and only certain men hold in common, whether then you think that these concepts are necessarily predicated on a masculine subject.
No, I wouldn't think so. So one of the writers I found very, very useful in this, so I like very much, it's essentially Hegel's recognition theory as investigated by Honneth, but Honneth has now taken it way back beyond Hegel into earlier stages of European thought. But I really do like that tradition of thought. The idea of the mutual independence of recognition between any two human beings, regardless of their social status. And one of the people who applies that very, very powerfully is Kate Mann in the book Down Girl, if you're aware of that. So I found that enormously influential, especially in a piece that I wrote recently about slavery, ancient Greek slavery, and whether there's any recognition for the slave. So I think what is said there, or what could be said there about enslaved people in the ancient Greek world, could be said about women in situations in the ancient Greek world where they have no political rights, for example. It's not that they have no rights whatsoever, but they have no civic rights of participation. But Mann points out, in contradistinction to someone whose name I've forgotten, a psychologist published a book a few years ago on dehumanization. And it's true that there are lots and lots of strategies in individuals and groups throughout the world, and there are lots of fairly robust psychology experiments too that show that these things of misrecognition, contempt, and all those kind of things, failures of sympathy and empathy and all that kind of stuff, are more pronounced where people see others as further away from their own group. And so the guy whose name I've forgotten, I've got a slide in a different presentation that's got his book on it, but I can't remember his name. He argues that this is literally dehumanization, that these are people who think that this other is not really a human being. And he works with a kind of equivocal notion of what it is to be human. So there's a kind of basic biological notion, and then there's a normative notion. And he says these are human beings who don't meet the normative notion of humanity. Kate Mann says that's just not true. It's really just not true. People who denigrate other human beings of different races, people who denigrate women if they're men, they know perfectly well that these other people are human beings and they have claims to recognition. The whole point is precisely to deny the claim, which is a way of recognizing that the claim exists. So I would say that, I've said that in this article about ancient Greek, ancient Athenian slaves, who were in fact protected to some degree against dishonor by the law. There's a law against hubris, which prohibits hubris against slaves. And my colleague Mirko Canevaro said it's not about the slave, it's about the agent. I think it's also about the slave. But I think you could apply that. I mean, obviously we should apply it across the board in any society to women as they now are as equals. But even when they're not regarded as equals, in societies in which they are very much oppressed, I think we can see that same logic still in operation. And so honor, which is an archaic and quaint sounding term, but what it refers to is something very, very fundamental. This basic human desire for the recognition that everyone else enjoys is absolutely something that applies to women.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and please forgive my post-flu voice. I'm also a medievalist. My corner of medieval Europe is Iceland, which has this tremendous literature where everyone is very excited about honor all the time. Several genres in which it operates differently. So I have about 1 million questions, and I would love to bend your ear about all of that, but I have a meta question instead about honor versus dignity, and I agree completely. There's quite obviously been this history of labeling as honor society groups that are marginalized to further marginalize them. Occasionally it flips around because Iceland, but it's the same thing. And there are all these associations that make that supposedly bad. But there's this dignity thing, and this is maybe just from ignorance for me. What is supposedly so great about dignity?
Well, exactly.
Is it just that but what are the people who are writing about this saying? I have the germ of a hypothesis, but you probably know and you can tell me.
Yeah. I mean, the dignity thing, there are people who write about dignity, but those who write persuasively about dignity don't see it as an asocial thing. They do see it as a social and performative thing, as inevitably it must be. I mean, dignity is a sense of you're meeting standards that you endorse, and the standards are very unlikely to be entirely unique to yourself. The standards are inevitably those that you have decided are the social standards that you personally would like to live up to. So it's both individual and social at the same time. The move that I don't get is trying to make it all internal, all subjective.
That's exactly the move. I mean, it's clear to us that this is not operating in a vacuum. I'm trying to grasp what is attractive to thinkers who are clearly the superior thing is to be totally in a vacuum. Yeah. It's nonsense. But what was so great about that? Well,
I can tell you a bit more about the sort of counterpart, the shame guilt culture antithesis, because I did once investigate the complete genesis of that, and it was essentially self-definition. So this was something. I mean, it started with Boas, but was really taken on by Benedict and Mead in the 20s and 30s of the last century. And the first people who are characterized as shame cultures are the Native Americans. And the claim is basically that Native Americans, but also other groups within the United States who don't share the advantage of being white, Anglo-Saxon, or Protestant, are deficient in this degree of internalization of values. They care too much about what other people think. They're too motivated by external sanctions. And there's a fiction there. There's a fundamental lie that they're telling themselves about the superiority of a Protestant's communication personal with their own individual relationship with God.
And that's exactly what I was wondering if there's some sort of weird cultural Protestantism going on. It's like, oh, it's entirely internal, you know.
Well, I mean, I come from a Presbyterian Calvinist country, and I can tell you it's just not like that, and never has been, you know. So when Robert Burns was literally pilloried for his various malfeasances in the local community in Ayrshire in the 18th century, he was made to sit on what they called the stool of repentance, but it wasn't about repentance. This was publicly there in the church, you know. So he was shamed, and other people who had committed similar infractions were publicly shamed for their offences in this so-called Presbyterian guilt culture.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I'd like to seize the prerogative, if that's okay,
sure,
to ask about the relationship. It's a two-part question. You've given us a wonderful talk largely on Time. Mm-hmm. You've also looked historically at eidos. Mm-hmm. All these terms are very difficult to translate. You've also, of course, looked at hubris.
Yep.
How do these terms relate to each other? Are they really sort of different aspects of the same phenomenon? Are there clear distinctions? That's one question. And the other question is, diachronically, do these relationships change over time as society changes, as linguistic terms and the relationship to each other change? Could you shed some light on both?
Yeah, no, I don't detect any significant change in the sense or reference of time or hubris over the longest period that I've, so you know, from Homer to Plutarch, let's say, and I know from at least the studies of Martin Hinterberger on Byzantine approaches to both eidos and hubris, that it's very much the same kind of thing there. The trouble is, in Byzantine Greek, eidos is essentially a fiction. So their vernacular word for shame is dropi by that time, from entropy. They've even given up aiskene by that time. So the main development is simply the obsolescence of eidos as a term in common use. So it becomes poetic. You don't find it in 4th century prose unless they're thematizing, as Aristotle sometimes does, ideas from the past. So aiskene takes over from eidos as the default term for shame. And aiskene tends to have more prototypical associations of shame than it does of respect. So you can say, aiskunomaise, to mean I respect you, but it's not as common as aideomaise once was at an earlier period and in poetic texts. So I think it's not necessarily about historical development, but there are distinct prototype effects. So Aristotle, I think, gives us one when he defines time in terms of the sign of a reputation for beneficence and says that it's about, it has a relationship to arete, to virtue. So insofar as time is a mark of your excellence, it's primarily what Darwell calls appraisal respect. And I think that's what people think of first. And I think, interestingly enough, that's what modern scholars think of first too. So when we think about honour, we're thinking about things like, you know, the whole system of philotimia and people doing things in classical Athenian contexts in order to have statues and inscriptions erected to them and that kind of thing. We don't think about it in terms of positive respect. But of course, that's what eidos means, or can mean. But even then, when Aristotle discusses eidos, and he does it as a relatively archaic term, and he very quickly resorts immediately to aiskene again, he doesn't think of the I respect sense, he takes it in the sense of shame. And so his objection against eidos is that it's perfectly okay to have a sense that stops you doing shameful things in the future, but that sense also entails that you would feel shame if you'd already done bad things, and if you've already done bad things, you're not a good person. So he doesn't like it for those reasons, and respect for other people never comes into it. But I mean, you still cannot deny that the term has these two senses, and that the two senses are not just semantically related to each other. I think they're sociologically related to each other too. And you see interesting prototype effects also with the adjective eidoios. So whereas eidos, people, if you asked a native informant, what does eidos mean? They would say shame, or they would give you an example that indicated shame. If you ask them what eidoios means, they would mean entitled to respect, because that's overwhelmingly its sense, except when it refers to the genitalia, and then it means, the shamtaila, pudenda. But eidoios means I need to respect this person. Precisely Darwell's recognition respect. So things go up and down, and you can never believe what native informants are telling you. So when a native informant defines something, you need to be very, very cautious. And that's the time to go to the TLG and search out all the interests, all the incidences, and see if they're right. Because inevitably we reduce complexity when we try and do these things. We think of the best examples. We think of the sparrow, not of the pelican,
Absolutely. But what is the relationship then between the different terms? Are they, is it the sort of thing that one could create a taxonomy and say, Time is this, and hybris is that, and eidos is this other thing? Or are they all too interrelated in some sort of way? And you can just
they're interrelated, yeah. So eidos is about time.
Right.
But equally, there's a sense in which time can be synonymous with eidos.
Right.
So eideomaise and timose can mean exactly the same thing.
Right.
I respect you. And when people are talking about respect, which they actually do comparatively rarely, so it's again the prototype effect in action, they do oscillate between time or totiman and eidos and eideistai. So those two things are reciprocally correlated, but they can also overlap as in particular contexts as synonyms. Hubris is a violation of these relationships. So it again exists in a relationship to that. So if you're responding to someone else with either time or eidos, then you're clearly not behaving towards that person with hubris. Hubris relates to time both insofar as it's about me and insofar as it's about them. It gets even more complicated when you look at, it's always a good idea to look at Aristotle on these things. He's the best witness on so many counts. But when you do look at what he says, especially, for example, in Book 2 of the Rhetoric, there isn't just time, eidos, or aiskune and hubris. There's axia as well. And axia is Aristotle's word for time in the subjective sense that I was talking about earlier, or dignity, if you like. Axia is Aristotle's name for the sense that I have entitlements to respect on the part of other people. But in ordinary Greek, that can be time.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to... Please.
Thank you so much. I wanted just to ask you about the passage in Euripides' Hippolytus, where Phaedrus says that there are two kinds of eidos, and how that squares with the two types, the two eidos.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult passage that I've tried to deal with on a couple of occasions. On the one hand, I don't think it is two kinds of eidos. So I think diseidesin is hedonai. So hedonai had been mentioned as the subject of the previous sentence in the plural. The next sentence has diseidesin with no change of subject, and I think it's hedonai that are double or of two kinds. But of course eidos is one of the hedonai that's mentioned, and it's the one that really stands out, because the others are makrai leskai kai skole terpnon kakon kai eidos te. So it's long conversations in leather, not leather, leisure.
That was brilliant.
And whatever the other one is. And eidos. So clearly, Phaedra thematizes eidos as the most problematic of those 2 or 3 pleasures, however many there may be, because you can kind of see how long conversations might lead you into error and interfere with your desire to implement tokalon, the good, in your moral life. And you can see how, leisure might allow the devil to make work for idle hands and so on. But eidos is a good thing. So what's the problem there? And well, I've argued that it's precisely the issues that I've been talking about here, that there's a sense in which Phaedra's eidos is about knowing what she must do, because it's the right thing to do, and it's kalon in that sense. But in that very same great speech, before she makes eidos one of the ambivalent pleasures, she says the trouble is people know the right thing to do and they don't act it out. Some out of idleness, some because they put some pleasure before tokalon, some other pleasure before tokalon. So this is about doing the right thing being pleasant, but other things being pleasant too. And having to judge between these things qua pleasant in the way that Socrates says we have to do in the Protagoras. So it's precisely about this notion of weakness of the will, akrasia, and so on. And in that play, there's so many occurrences of these shame and honor terms that it's pretty clear that on the one hand, Phaedra really does want to do the right thing. She doesn't want to give in to her desire to have sex with her stepson and betray her husband, but she's tempted. So it's pleasant. So the pleasure of doing the right thing and the pleasure of doing the naughty thing are in competition, and her sense of shame is pulling her in 2 directions. So in the ensuing conversation with the nurse is saying, well, what the eye doesn't see, the mind doesn't grieve over, and things like that. And many men have completely acquiesced in their wives' adultery. They don't really mind that much. And also, if nobody finds out, it'll be okay. And she says, then I have this pharmacon, and Phaedra has already said in the great speech, since these are my principles, there is no pharmacon that would ever make me change my mind. And then the nurse says, well, I've got this pharmacon. And she says, what kind of pharmacon is it? Do you rub it on or do you drink it? She doesn't say, no pharmaca. I've ruled those out already. And so she goes along with it in the way that she went along with the nurse before in the supplication scene, where she was saying, I'm never going to tell anyone what it is, I'm just going to die. And the nurse is going, tell me what it is. And then she tells her what it is. And that's eidos as well. She says, I'm giving in out of eidos for the sebas of your supplication. So we see lots and lots of eidos and time and tokalon words in the play, and it's all about this danger of there being a divergence between doing the right thing for its own sake and doing it because you'll be criticized if you're found to have done something other than the right thing. So I think that's what's going on there. That's why eidos is in the list.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, it's a testament to the richness of your paper, Douglas, that we've gone well past the 5:30 time. That is my fault as a chair, but I couldn't, it's hard to cut off the excellent questions here. Thank you for a brilliant capstone to a great series. I think it's worth thanking Professors Butler and Caban for the great Ura Garcia they've done for the intellectual community here in putting on this series, and to thank Professor Cairns for his wonderful benefaction. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Paper.
Thank you very much.